The entire saloon went dead silent when the mountain man slammed his fist on the bar and said he needed a wife before sunrise, or two children would be ripped from his arms forever. Nobody laughed. Not anymore. Because Gideon Holt, the most feared trapper in Wyoming territory, had tears running down his weathered face, and that scared people more than his reputation ever did. If you want to know how a desperate bargain in a frozen town became the most legendary family story ever told in the frontier, stay until the end. Drop a like and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter of 1874 hit Wyoming territory like a hammer to frozen iron. Snow piled 6 feet deep in places where roads used to be, and the wind carried a cold that could crack skin like old leather. In the small settlement of Aspen Ridge, barely 24 buildings clinging to existence between the mountains and the plains, people learned not to waste words or warmth. Survival wasn't poetic. It was ugly, repetitive, and mean. Gideon Holt knew that better than most. He'd lived alone in the high country for 19 years, trapping beaver and marten, hunting elk when the season allowed, and speaking to exactly nobody unless trading pelts forced him into town twice a year. He was a giant of a man, 6'4" in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer across his back without slowing down. His beard grew wild and dark, streaked with premature gray, and his hands looked like they'd been carved from the same granite as the mountains he called home. People in Aspen Ridge told stories about Gideon Holt, most of them exaggerated, some of them true, all of them designed to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. He was a ghost, a legend, a warning, and on the night of January 14th, he walked into the Red Pine Saloon and shattered every assumption the town had ever made about him. The saloon was packed tighter than usual that night. A supply wagon had made it through the pass before the latest storm closed the road, which meant fresh whiskey, real tobacco, and enough salt pork to last another month. Men crowded around the bar, their voices loud and rough, their laughter sharp-edged with the kind of relief that comes from dodging starvation one more time. A few women sat near the stove in the back, laundresses, a cook from the boarding house, a seamstress named Clara Bennett, who kept to herself and never smiled much. The door banged open so hard it rattled the hinges. Cold air rushed in like a living thing, snuffing out half the candles on the tables and sending a shiver through the room that had nothing to do with temperature. Every head turned. Gideon Holt stood in the doorway. Snow clung to his bearskin coat. Ice crusted his beard. His eyes, gray as a January sky, swept across the room with an intensity that made grown men look away. He didn't move for a long moment, just stood there breathing hard, his massive chest rising and falling like he'd run the entire 15 miles from his cabin. "Jesus Christ," somebody muttered. The bartender, a thick-necked man named Pike, who'd once killed a man in Denver over a card game, took an instinctive step backward. Gideon. Gideon didn't answer. He walked straight to the bar, his boots leaving wet tracks on the plank floor, and when he reached the counter, he didn't sit. He stood there, towering over everyone, and slowly pulled off his gloves. His hands were shaking. Pike had never seen Gideon Holt's hands shake. "Whiskey," Gideon said. His voice came out rough, like he hadn't used it in weeks. Maybe he hadn't. Pike poured without asking questions. The glass looked tiny in Gideon's grip. He drank it in one swallow, slammed the glass down, and then turned to face the room. "I need a wife." The words dropped into the silence like stones into a frozen pond. For 3 full seconds, nobody reacted. Then someone in the back started to laugh, a nervous, disbelieving sound that spread through the room like a brush fire. Within moments, the entire saloon was roaring with laughter. Men slapped tables. Someone whistled. A burly logger named Frank Jessup actually doubled over, wheezing. "A wife!" Frank gasped between laughs. "Gideon Holt wants a wife." Did he forget what women look like after all those years alone? Maybe he wants to marry his rifle. The laughter built on itself, feeding and growing, until the whole room shook with it. Even Pike cracked a smile behind the bar. It was absurd. Gideon Holt, the man who once walked 30 miles through a blizzard with a broken leg rather than spend a single night in town, asking for a wife like he was ordering a drink. But Gideon didn't laugh. He stood perfectly still, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on something beyond the walls. The laughter started to falter. One by one, men noticed the look on his face and fell quiet. The silence spread like ice forming on a lake, until the only sound was the crackling of the wood stove and the wind howling outside. "I need a wife before sunrise," Gideon said again. His voice was steady now, but there was something underneath it, something raw and desperate that made people uncomfortable. "I need someone to stand beside me when the judge opens his office at dawn. That's 7 hours from now." Pike leaned forward, his smile gone. "Gideon, what the hell are you talking about?" Gideon's throat worked. For a moment, it looked like he might not answer. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, dirty, creased, barely holding together. He set it on the bar. "3 weeks ago, I found a wagon in Blackstone Canyon. Broken axle. Couple inside, both dead from fever. They'd been dead maybe 2 days." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the bar so hard his knuckles went white. Their kids were still alive. Boy and a girl. Caleb's 8, Rose is 5. The room had gone so quiet you could hear the snow hitting the windows. "I brought them back to my cabin," Gideon continued. "Fed them. Kept them warm. Figured I'd bring them to town when the pass cleared, find someone to take them in. But then the territorial marshal came through last week. Said any man keeping orphans without a wife in the house is breaking territorial law. Said if I don't have a proper household, a woman in it, he's taking those kids to the orphanage in Cheyenne." Someone swore softly. Everyone in Wyoming territory knew about the Cheyenne orphanage. It wasn't a place where children went to find new families. It was a place where children went to disappear, worked half to death in factory contracts, shipped east to God knows where, lost in a system that didn't give a damn about frontier kids with no names and no futures. "The marshal's coming back at dawn," Gideon said. "He's bringing a wagon. If I don't have a wife standing beside me when he knocks on that door, he's taking Caleb and Rose, and I'll never see them again." The weight of those words settled over the room like a wet blanket. Pike rubbed his face. "Jesus, Gideon, that's... shit. "I know what it is," Gideon cut him off. His voice cracked, just barely. "I know it's insane. I know I got no right to ask, but those kids..." He stopped, his jaw working. They already lost everything. Their ma, their pa, everything they knew. And I promised them... His voice broke completely. "I promised them I wouldn't let anyone take them away." A tear ran down his face, cutting a clean line through 3 weeks of trail dust. That's when the room understood. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some half-drunk mountain man stumbling into town with a wild story. This was real. Gideon Holt, the man who'd survived winters that killed lesser men, who'd fought off wolves and outlaws and every brutal thing the frontier could throw at him, was standing in front of them completely broken, begging for help. Frank Jessup cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Gideon, you can't just marry someone in 7 hours. That ain't how it works." "I got a license." Gideon pulled another paper from his coat. "Paid the clerk in Bridger last week. It's legal. All it needs is a signature, a preacher, and a woman willing to sign her name." "And then what?" Pike asked quietly. "You drag some poor woman up to your cabin in the middle of winter? Make her play house with 2 kids she's never met and a man she don't know?" "I ain't dragging nobody," Gideon said sharply. "I'm asking. And yeah, it's a bad deal, I know that. I got nothing to offer except a roof that don't leak much and more work than any person should have to do. But I'll keep her safe. I'll work every day to make sure she don't regret it. And those kids..." His voice softened. "Those kids need a ma. They need someone who knows how to be gentle. I don't know how to do that. I know how to trap and hunt and survive, but I don't know how to make a little girl stop crying in the middle of the night because she wants her mama." He looked around the room, meeting eyes. "So I'm asking. I ain't too proud to beg. If there's a woman here or anywhere in this town who's willing to take a chance on a fool mountain man and 2 scared kids, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure she don't regret it." Silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The women in the back of the room looked at each other, then looked away. It was too much, too fast, too desperate. Marriage wasn't something you decided in a saloon at midnight because a stranger asked nicely. It was a life sentence, especially out here, where divorce didn't exist and walking away meant dying in the snow. Gideon stood there for another long moment, hope draining out of him like water from a cracked bucket. Then he nodded slowly, like he'd expected this all along. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, I figured." He turned toward the door. "Wait." The voice came from the back of the room, near the stove. Quiet, steady, female. Everyone turned. Clara Bennett stood up from her chair. She was 34 years old, thin in a way that suggested too many missed meals, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face that might have been pretty once, before grief carved lines around her mouth and eyes. She wore a plain gray dress that had been mended so many times it was hard to tell what the original fabric looked like. Her hands, rough from years of sewing, were folded in front of her. She looked directly at Gideon. "You said their names are Caleb and Rose?" Gideon turned slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Yes, ma'am." "How long have they been with you?" 3 weeks. "Are they sick?" "No, ma'am." "Healthy. Eating good." Clara took a step forward. The entire saloon watched her move through the tables like she was walking through deep water. "Do they know you're here?" she asked. Gideon hesitated. "I told them I was going to town to fix things. I didn't tell them what that meant." Clara stopped a few feet away from him. She was tiny compared to Gideon, barely reached his chest, but something in the way she held herself made her seem taller. "I need to know one thing," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "And I need the truth, not what you think I want to hear." "Yes, ma'am." "Will you be kind to them?" The question hung in the air. Gideon's face did something complicated. Surprise, confusion, and then something that looked almost like pain. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I'll be kind," he said finally. His voice was rough. "I swear to you, ma'am, I'll be kind to them. And to you. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to be a father, but I know how to keep my word, and I'm giving it to you right now. I will be kind." Clara studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have been enough, because she nodded once. "Then I'll marry you." The saloon exploded. "Clara, you can't. Have you lost your mind? You don't even know him." Clara ignored all of it. She kept her eyes on Gideon. "I have 3 conditions." Gideon looked like he'd been hit in the head with a rock. "Anything. First, I'm not your property. I'll be your wife in name and I'll help raise those children, but I'm not signing my life away to be somebody's servant. We're partners, or we're nothing." "Yes, ma'am." "Second, you don't touch me unless I say it's all right. I don't care what the law says about marital rights. My body is mine." Gideon's face went red, but he nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "Third, if those children are hurt, if they're scared or neglected or treated poorly, I'm gone. I don't care if it's the middle of winter. I'll walk back to this town and you'll never see me again. Those kids come first, always." "They do," Gideon said immediately. "They will, I promise." Clara took a breath. "Let it out." Then she stuck out her hand. "Then we have an agreement." Gideon stared at her hand like it was a miracle. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and shook it. His massive hand swallowed hers completely, but his grip was gentle. "Thank you," he whispered. I don't even know how to—" "Don't," Clara said quietly. "We'll figure it out as we go." The next 6 hours passed in a blur. Pike disappeared and came back with Reverend Tomas, a wizened old man who'd married half the couples in Aspen Ridge and buried the other half. He took one look at the situation, sighed heavily, and agreed to perform the ceremony immediately. "You're both fools," he muttered while digging through his bag for the marriage register. "But I've seen dumber reasons to get married. At least you're doing it for the kids." Clara went back to the boarding house where she rented a room and packed everything she owned into a single canvas bag. It didn't take long. A change of clothes, her sewing kit, a leather-bound book, the only thing she had left from her first marriage. She stood in that tiny room for a moment, looking at the walls she'd stared at for 3 years, and felt absolutely nothing. This wasn't home. Home had died 6 years ago with her husband and infant daughter, both taken by cholera in the same week. This was just a place where she existed between jobs, too numb to care about much of anything except surviving another day. But those children, Caleb and Rose, they were real. They were alive. They needed help. Maybe that was enough. When she walked back into the saloon, Gideon was standing near the bar with the Reverend. He'd tried to clean himself up a little, brushed the snow out of his beard, straightened his coat. It didn't help much. He still looked like a mountain come to life. Their eyes met across the room. Clara walked forward and stood beside him. Reverend Tomas opened his book. Let's make this quick. I'm too old to be up this late. The ceremony lasted less than 5 minutes. There were no flowers, no music, no guests except for Pike, and a couple of drunks who'd passed out at a corner table. Gideon repeated the vows in a voice so quiet Clara had to lean in to hear him. When it came time to say her own vows, Clara's voice was steady. She wasn't afraid. Fear required hope, and she'd run out of that a long time ago. This was just a transaction, a practical decision. She'd made worse ones. I now pronounce you man and wife, Reverend Tomas said. He looked at Gideon. You can kiss the bride if that's something you're planning to do. Gideon looked at Clara, panicked. Clara shook her head once. We're skipping that part. Fine by me, the Reverend said. He produced the marriage certificate, and they both signed it. Gideon's handwriting shaky and rough, Clara's precise and small. Reverend Tomas added his signature, pressed his seal into the wax, and handed the document to Gideon. Congratulations, he said dryly. Try not to kill each other? Tut. They left Aspen Ridge just before dawn, riding Gideon's horse with Clara sitting behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist to keep from falling off. The snow had stopped, but the cold was vicious. Clara's face went numb within the first mile. She pressed closer to Gideon's back, trying to steal warmth from his massive frame. He didn't speak. Neither did she. The trail climbed steadily into the mountains, winding through forests so thick the snow barely reached the ground beneath the pines. Clara had never been this far from town. She'd heard stories about the high country, about trappers who went mad from isolation, about wolves that could smell fear, about winters so brutal that people froze to death in their own cabins. She wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Almost there? Gideon said suddenly. His voice startled her. How much farther? Another mile. You all right? I'm fine. He didn't push. They rode in silence. The cabin appeared suddenly, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. It was bigger than Clara expected, a solid structure built from thick logs, with a stone chimney leaking smoke into the gray morning sky. A small barn stood nearby, and she could see a chicken coop, a woodpile that looked like it could last through 2 winters, and a creek running along the edge of the clearing. Gideon brought the horse to a stop and dismounted. He reached up to help Clara down, and she let him, her legs numb from the ride. Wait here, he said quietly. Let me talk to them first. He walked to the cabin door and opened it carefully. Clara stayed by the horse, her heart suddenly pounding. She heard a child's voice inside, high and frightened. Where were you? You said you'd be back before I woke up. I know, Caleb. I'm sorry. Something came up. What came up? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's fine now. Better than fine. A pause. Why are you smiling? The child sounded suspicious. Because I brought someone home with me. Someone who's going to help us. Clara took a breath and walked toward the door. When she stepped inside, 2 pairs of eyes locked onto her immediately. The boy, Caleb, was small for 8, with dark hair sticking up in every direction and eyes too old for his face. He stood in front of a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5. Her blonde hair tangled, her face smudged with dirt. They both wore clothes that were too big, probably scavenged from their parents' belongings. They looked terrified. Who's that? Caleb demanded. He moved slightly, putting himself between Clara and his sister. This is Clara, Gideon said gently. She's my... He hesitated, like the word felt strange in his mouth. She's my wife. We got married last night. Caleb's face went through several emotions at once. Confusion, disbelief, anger. You got married? I had to, Gideon said. The marshal's coming today, remember? I told you about that. He said I needed a wife, or he'd take you and Rose away. So I went to town and found one. You found one? Caleb's voice rose. You can't just find a wife. That's not how it works. Well, I did, Gideon said. And now she's here. And when the marshal comes, he'll see that we're a proper household, and he'll leave you 2 alone. Caleb stared at Clara like she was a snake that had just slithered through the door. We don't need her. Caleb, we don't. We're fine. You and me and Rose, we're fine. We ain't fine, Gideon said quietly. You know we ain't. I'm doing the best I can, but it's not enough. Rose needs... He stopped, struggling for words. She needs someone who knows how to be a ma. And you need that too, even if you don't think you do. I don't need anything, Caleb said fiercely. Tears welled in his eyes, but he blinked them back. And neither does Rose. We don't need some stranger coming in here pretending to care about us. The words hit Clara harder than she expected. She'd known this wouldn't be easy, but seeing the raw pain in this child's face, the fear and anger and desperate need to protect his sister, made something crack open in her chest. She crouched down slowly, bringing herself to Caleb's eye level. "You're right," she said quietly. Caleb blinked. "What?" "You're right. I am a stranger. And I'm not your ma. I'm not going to pretend to be." Clara kept her voice steady. "But I'm here because Gideon asked me to help, and I said yes. Not because I need anything from you, not because I think I can replace what you lost, but because sometimes people need help, and sometimes other people are willing to give it." Caleb's jaw worked. "Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Clara thought about that, about her own daughter, cold in the ground, about the empty years that followed, about how she'd spent 6 years just waiting to die because living hurt too much. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," she said finally. "And I know what it's like when nobody helps." Silence filled the cabin. Rose, who had been hiding behind her brother, peeked out, her huge blue eyes fixed on Clara. "Are you nice?" she asked in a tiny voice. Clara felt something twist in her chest. "I try to be." "Do you know how to make pancakes?" Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. "I do." "Gideon doesn't know how to make pancakes," Rose said seriously. "He tries, but they always taste like wood." "They don't taste like wood," Gideon protested weakly. "They do," Caleb muttered. Clara stood up. "Then I guess I should make breakfast. And after that, we'll figure out what happens next. All of us. Together." She looked at Gideon. "That's how this works, right? We figure it out together?" Gideon nodded, something like relief washing over his face. "Yeah, together. But." The marshal arrived 2 hours later, just as the sun broke over the mountains. He was a hard-faced man named Pritchard, with a badge pinned to his coat and a wagon waiting at the edge of the clearing. He knocked on the cabin door like he was trying to break it down. Gideon opened it. Clara stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on Rose's shoulder. Caleb stood on Gideon's other side, his face set in a scowl. Pritchard looked at them for a long moment. His eyes lingered on Clara. "This your wife?" he asked Gideon. "Yes, sir." "Got proof?" Gideon handed him the marriage certificate. Pritchard studied it carefully, looking for any sign of forgery. He found nothing. Reverend Tomas's seal was clear as day. "Married last night?" Pritchard's tone was skeptical. "Yes, sir." "That's awfully convenient." "It's legal," Clara said quietly. "I'm here of my own free will, and these children are being cared for. That's what the law requires, isn't it?" Pritchard's eyes narrowed. "You sure about this, ma'am? You know what you're signing up for out here?" "I'm sure." He didn't look convinced, but he also didn't have a legal leg to stand on. Gideon had done exactly what he'd been told to do. The household was complete. The children had a mother and a father. Pritchard folded the certificate and handed it back. "Fine. But I'll be checking in. If I hear those kids are being mistreated—" "They won't be," Gideon said firmly. Pritchard gave him a long, hard look. Then he tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am." He turned and walked back to his wagon. Clara watched him climb up, snap the reins, and disappear down the trail. When the sound of the wagon faded completely, Caleb let out a breath he'd been holding. "Is he gone?" Rose whispered. "He's gone," Gideon said. Rose looked up at Clara. "Does that mean you're staying?" Clara looked down at the little girl, at her tangled hair and her too big dress, and her eyes full of hope and fear in equal measure. She thought about the empty room back in Aspen Ridge, the life that wasn't really a life, the slow, grinding emptiness of just existing. And then she thought about pancakes. "Yeah," Clara said softly. "I'm staying." For the first time in 6 years, Clara Bennett smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first week nearly broke them all. Clara woke up that second morning in a cabin that smelled like wood smoke, unwashed children, and something she couldn't identify that might have been spoiled meat. The bed she'd slept in, Gideon's bed, which he'd given up without argument and moved himself to the floor near the stove, was harder than the boarding house cot she'd left behind. Her back ached. Her hands were already cracked from the cold. And when she opened her eyes to gray dawn light filtering through a window that hadn't been cleaned in probably a decade, she had approximately 3 seconds of peace before Rose's scream shattered the silence. Clara was on her feet before she was fully awake, her heart hammering. She stumbled through the main room, nearly tripping over Gideon's massive form, still wrapped in blankets on the floor, and burst into the small side room where the children slept. Rose was sitting up in her bed, sobbing so hard she was choking on it. Caleb sat beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his face pale and helpless. "What happened?" Claire's voice came out sharper than she intended. "She has nightmares," Caleb said quietly. "Almost every night. I can usually calm her down, but—" "I want Mama," Rose wailed. Her whole body shook. "I want Mama! I want Mama! I want—" Clara crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't reach for Rose, didn't try to hold her. She just sat there, close enough to be present, far enough to not crowd. "I know you do," Clara said softly. Rose's crying stuttered, confusion breaking through the grief for just a moment. She'd probably expected an adult to tell her it was okay, that everything would be fine, that she needed to be brave. All the useless things people said to children who were drowning. "I know you want your mama," Clara continued, "and I'm sorry she's not here. That's not fair, and it's not right, and I can't fix it." Rose stared at her with huge wet eyes. "But I'm here," Clara said, "and I'm not going anywhere. So if you need to cry, you cry. I'll sit right here until you're done." Rose's face crumpled again, and the sobs came back, but quieter this time, less frantic. She cried for another 10 minutes while Clara sat perfectly still, her hand resting on the blanket near Rose's knee, close, but not touching. Caleb watched them both with an expression Clara couldn't read. When Rose finally wound down to hiccups and sniffles, Clara stood up. "You hungry?" Rose nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Then let's make breakfast." She walked back into the main room. Gideon was sitting up now, his hair sticking out in every direction, his face creased with worry. "Is she—" "She's fine," Clara said. "She's a little girl who lost her mother. She's going to cry. That's what little girls do." Gideon looked like he wanted to say something, but Clara was already moving toward the stove. She found a cast-iron pan hanging from a hook, a sack of cornmeal that was nearly empty, some eggs that looked questionable, and a jar of lard that had probably been sitting there since before the children arrived. She got to work. Cooking in Gideon's cabin was like cooking in a cave. Nothing was where it should be. The knives were all dull. There was exactly 1 pot, 2 pans, and a total of 5 plates that didn't match. Clara found herself muttering under her breath as she tried to figure out how to make something edible from the limited supplies. "Need help?" Gideon asked from behind her. "I need a better kitchen," Clara said without turning around. "But I'll make do." 20 minutes later, she set plates of cornmeal pancakes, actual pancakes, not the charred disasters Gideon had apparently been serving, on the rough wooden table. The children sat down warily, like they weren't sure if this was allowed. Gideon sat at the head of the table, watching Clara with an expression that made her deeply uncomfortable. "What?" she asked. "Nothing. Just thank you. It's breakfast. Don't get emotional about it." But Rose took 1 bite of her pancake and her eyes went wide. "It doesn't taste like wood." Caleb tried his and didn't say anything, but he ate 3 more without complaint. Clara sat down with her own plate and realized she was hungrier than she'd thought. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin plates and the crackling of the fire in the stove. "So," Gideon said finally, clearing his throat, "I was thinking I need to check my trap lines today. I've been neglecting them, and if I don't get out there soon, I'm going to lose pelts to scavengers. It'll take most of the day." Clara nodded. "All right. I was thinking maybe you and the kids could, I don't know, maybe you could—" He fumbled for words. "I don't want to leave you alone on your 2nd day, but—" "We'll be fine," Clara said. "Go check your traps." "You sure?" "I've been alone before. I think I can manage a cabin and 2 children for a few hours." Gideon looked relieved and guilty at the same time. "I'll be back before dark." He left an hour later, bundled in his furs, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Clara watched him disappear into the trees and then turned to face the cabin, and the 2 children staring at her like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. "All right," she said. "Let's figure out what needs doing." What needed doing, it turned out, was everything. The cabin was a disaster. Dishes piled in a bucket that served as a sink. Clothes strewn across the floor, some clean, some not, no way to tell which was which. The corner where the children slept smelled like urine, which meant somebody had been having accidents and nobody had cleaned them up properly. The floor hadn't been swept in weeks. The windows were so filthy Clara couldn't see through them. She stood in the middle of it all and felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it made her dizzy. Then she rolled up her sleeves. "Caleb," she said, "you're in charge of firewood. I need the wood box filled and I need kindling stacked by the stove. Can you do that?" Caleb looked surprised that she was asking instead of ordering. "Yeah, I can do that." "Rose, you're going to help me with the dishes. You can't reach the bucket, so you'll hand me the dirty ones and I'll wash them. Sound good?" Rose nodded eagerly. They worked all morning. Clara scrubbed dishes until her hands were raw, then moved on to the floors, sweeping out dirt and mouse droppings and things she didn't want to identify. She stripped the children's bedding and boiled it in a pot outside over a fire she barely managed to start. Caleb hauled water from the creek until his arms shook. Rose organized the clean dishes on the shelf with intense concentration, making sure each plate was perfectly aligned. By midday, Clara's back was screaming and her hands were bleeding from a dozen small cuts, but the cabin looked almost livable. She made a simple lunch, bread and cheese from Gideon's stores, and they sat at the table again. Rose was chattering now, her earlier grief temporarily forgotten, telling Clara about a bird she'd seen that morning that had red feathers. "That was probably a cardinal," Clara said. "What's a cardinal?" "A kind of bird. They're pretty common around here. Have you seen one?" "I have." "What else have you seen?" And just like that, Clara found herself in her first real conversation with a 5-year-old girl who wanted to know everything about everything. What kind of birds were there? What about squirrels? Did bears really sleep all winter? What did they dream about? Clara answered as best she could, aware of Caleb listening from across the table, even though he pretended not to be interested. "Do you have any kids?" Rose asked suddenly. The question hit Clara like a fist to the stomach. She set down her bread carefully. "I did," she said, "a long time ago." "Where are they now?" "Rose," Caleb said sharply. "Don't ask stuff like that." "Why not?" "Because—" Caleb looked at Clara, his face uncertain. "It's all right," Clara said quietly. "I had a daughter. Her name was Sarah. She died when she was 6 months old." Rose's face fell. "Oh." "It was a long time ago," Clara said again, though it didn't feel like a long time. It felt like yesterday. "But I still think about her." "Do you miss her?" "Every day?" Rose thought about that for a moment. Then she reached across the table and put her small, sticky hand on top of Clara's. "I miss my mama every day, too," she said. Clara's throat closed up completely. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She just sat there with this child's hand on hers, feeling something crack open inside her chest that she'd kept locked away for 6 years. "Me too," Caleb said quietly. He wasn't looking at either of them. "I miss both of them. Every day." They sat like that for a long moment, 3 people bound together by grief they couldn't fix. Then Rose pulled her hand back and picked up her bread. "Can I have more cheese?" "Yes," Clara managed. "You can have more cheese." The afternoon passed in a blur of more work. Clara tackled the filthy windows, scrubbing them with rags and vinegar until she could actually see the mountains outside. She reorganized Gideon's food stores, discovering that half of what he had was either spoiled or close to it. She made a mental list of everything they needed, which turned out to be nearly everything. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, vegetables that weren't 6 months old and borderline rotten, soap that actually worked, fabric for new clothes because what the children were wearing was falling apart, needles and thread, lamp oil, a proper washboard instead of the flat rock Gideon had apparently been using. The list got longer and longer until Clara realized they'd need a wagon just to haul it all back from town. Gideon returned just as the sun was setting, his face windburned and tired. He stopped in the doorway of the cabin and stared. "Did you—" He looked around, taking in the clean floors, the organized shelves, the windows that actually let in light. "Did you do all this today?" "Someone had to," Clara said. She was stirring a pot of stew over the stove, made from the last of the edible vegetables and some questionable jerky she'd found in the back of the pantry. "You've been living like a wild animal." "I know," Gideon said. He sounded embarrassed. "I'm not good at— I don't know how to keep things clean. Clearly. I'm sorry. Clara glanced at him. He looked genuinely miserable, standing there in his furs, tracking snow onto the floor she'd just cleaned. Take off your boots, she said, and wash your hands. Dinner's almost ready. They ate together again, the four of them crowded around the table. Gideon devoured 3 bowls of stew without speaking. The children ate more slowly, Rose swinging her legs under the table, Caleb watching Gideon with an expression Clara was starting to recognize. Love mixed with wariness, like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to feel safe. After dinner, Gideon produced a rabbit he'd caught in one of his traps. Thought maybe Rose would like to see it before I skin it. Gideon, Clara said. She's 5. I've shown her rabbits before. She likes them. Rose did, in fact, like the rabbit. She petted its soft fur with careful fingers while Gideon held it, and when he took it outside to prepare it for tomorrow's meal, she didn't cry. She just went back to playing with a cornhusk doll that looked like it was held together by hope and spit. Clara washed the dishes, again, while Caleb dried them. They worked in silence for a while. You don't have to stay, you know, Caleb said suddenly. Clara looked at him. What? I heard Gideon talking to the Reverend before the wedding. He said you didn't have to stay if you didn't want to. That the marshal wouldn't come back for a while, and you could leave if it was too hard. Is that what you want? For me to leave? Caleb's hands stilled on the plate he was drying. I don't know. That's honest. It's just... He struggled for words. What if you're nice now, but then you change? What if you decide we're too much work and you leave anyway? That's worse than if you'd never come at all. Clara set down the pot she was scrubbing. You're right. That would be worse. Caleb looked surprised again. I can't promise I'll never leave, Clara said carefully. I don't know what's going to happen any more than you do, but I can promise that if I leave, it won't be because you were too much work. It'll be because something went wrong that we couldn't fix, and I don't think that's going to happen. Why not? Because I don't break promises, Clara said. And I promised Gideon I'd help raise you and Rose. That means I'm staying. Caleb thought about that. My ma used to say promises don't mean anything if you're dead. Your ma was right, but I'm not dead, and neither are you, so let's just take it one day at a time and see what happens. Caleb nodded slowly. He went back to drying dishes. That night, Clara lay in Gideon's bed. Her bed now, she supposed, and listened to the wind howling outside. She could hear Gideon's breathing from across the room, slow and steady. From the children's room, she heard Rose whimper in her sleep and Caleb's quiet voice soothing her. She stared at the ceiling and wondered what the hell she was doing. This wasn't her family. These weren't her children. This man snoring softly by the stove wasn't her husband in any real sense. She was a stranger who'd walked into their lives because of a legal technicality and a desperate bargain made in a saloon at midnight. But when she closed her eyes, she saw Rose's hand reaching across the table, heard Caleb's voice asking if she was staying, felt the weight of Gideon's gratitude when he'd seen what she'd done to the cabin. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was less routine and more controlled chaos. Clara woke before dawn every morning to start the fire and make breakfast. Gideon left to check his trap lines or hunt, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes for days. The children orbited around Clara like uncertain planets, not quite sure where they belonged in this new arrangement. Rose warmed to her quickly, too quickly, in a way that made Clara's chest hurt. The little girl followed her everywhere, asking endless questions, demanding stories, climbing into Clara's lap while she sewed. She called Clara Miss Clara at first, testing the boundaries, seeing what was allowed. Caleb was harder. He helped when asked, but he didn't volunteer. He watched Clara with eyes that saw too much, cataloging her every move, waiting for her to fail or leave or turn cruel. He never complained, but he never relaxed either. And Gideon was the strangest piece of all. He was painfully, almost comically respectful. He knocked before entering rooms. He asked permission before moving furniture. He apologized constantly for things that didn't require apology, the cabin being too cold, the wind being too loud, his snoring keeping her awake even though it didn't. You don't have to do that, Clara told him one morning after he'd apologized for the 3rd time before breakfast. Do what? Act like you're walking on eggshells. This is your cabin. You live here. You live here too now. I'm aware of that, but you're allowed to exist without apologizing for it. Gideon looked uncomfortable. I just don't want you to feel, I don't know, trapped. If I felt trapped, I'd leave. Would you? Clara thought about that. Probably not in the middle of winter, but eventually yes. So stop apologizing and just be yourself. He tried. It didn't quite work. He was too aware of her, too careful. At night, he slept by the stove wrapped in blankets, even though there was room in the bed for both of them if they were practical about it. Claire had suggested it once, just sleeping on opposite sides, sharing warmth, and he'd looked so horrified she'd dropped the subject immediately. 2 weeks in, Clara made the trek back to Aspen Ridge with Gideon to buy supplies. They loaded up his horse and a mule he'd borrowed from a neighbor with flour, sugar, salt, coffee, beans, dried apples, fabric, thread, lamp oil, and 100 other things the cabin desperately needed. The bill was staggering. Clara watched Gideon count out his carefully hoarded money with a sinking feeling in her stomach. "This is more than you planned to spend," she said, "but it's fine." "It's not fine. You're going to run out." "Clara." He looked at her steadily. "I got enough. And we needed this stuff. I should have bought it weeks ago, but I didn't know what to get or how much. You did, so we're buying it." They rode back to the cabin in silence, the mule laden with supplies, snow starting to fall again. When they were about halfway home, Gideon spoke. "You're good at this." Clara glanced at him. "Good at what?" "Running a household, taking care of things. The kids, they're different now, calmer, cleaner." He paused. "Happier, I think." "Rose is happier. Caleb's still deciding. He'll come around. Maybe." "You don't think so?" Clara chose her words carefully. "I think Caleb's smart enough to know that people leave. His parents left, not by choice, but they still left. He's not going to trust anyone completely until he's sure they're staying. You're staying, though, right?" The question hung in the cold air. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm staying." Gideon nodded, relief visible in his shoulders. They rode on. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara sat at the table mending one of Caleb's shirts by lamplight. Gideon was working on a new trap near the stove, his hands moving with surprising precision for someone so large. "Can I ask you something?" he said suddenly. Clara didn't look up from her sewing. "You just did. I mean, can I ask you something personal?" Now she looked up. Gideon was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You can ask," she said. "I might not answer." "Why did you say yes? That night in the saloon? You didn't know me. You didn't know the kids. You had no reason to believe any of this would work out. So why'd you do it?" Clara set down the shirt. She thought about lying, giving him some noble reason that would make her sound better than she was. But she'd promised to be honest, and that included being honest with herself. "Because I was tired," she said finally. "Tired of living in that room. Tired of sewing clothes for other people's children while remembering my own. Tired of waking up every morning and not caring if I woke up at all." She met his eyes. "You offered me a purpose. Maybe it was a crazy purpose. Maybe it was a desperate one, but it was something, and I needed something." Gideon absorbed that. "That's it? You were just tired?" "I was tired of being alone," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." "Yeah," Gideon said quietly. "There is." They sat in silence for a moment. "For what it's worth," Gideon said, "I'm glad you were tired that night. I'm glad you said yes. I know this ain't what you signed up for." "I signed up for exactly this," Clara interrupted. "A cabin in the mountains with a man I don't know and 2 traumatized children. That's what I agreed to. And it's hard and it's messy, and some days I want to scream, but it's not worse than what I left behind. Still, thank you." Clara picked up the shirt again. "You're welcome. Now stop talking and let me finish this before the lamp runs out of oil." A month passed, then another. Winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Snow piled so high against the cabin walls that Gideon had to dig a tunnel to reach the barn. The creek froze solid. The wind howled like something alive and angry. But inside the cabin, something was shifting. Rose started calling Clara Mama one day in late February, just slipped it in casually while asking for more soup, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Clara's hands froze on the ladle. She looked at Gideon, panicked, not sure if she should correct it. Gideon just smiled. "You want more soup, Rosie?" Clara asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Yes, Mama." There it was again. Clara served the soup and didn't correct her. And when she glanced at Caleb, she saw something complicated flash across his face. Not quite approval, not quite acceptance, but not rejection either. Progress, she thought. Maybe. That night, long after everyone was asleep, Clara lay in bed and cried for the first time since arriving at the cabin. She cried for Sarah, who would never call her mama again. She cried for Rose, who'd lost her real mother and was settling for Clara instead. She cried for herself, for this strange half-life she was living, for the fact that she was starting to care about these people, and caring meant the possibility of loss. She cried until she was empty. And then in the darkness she heard movement, footsteps. The door to her room opened a crack. "Miss Clara?" Caleb's voice, small and uncertain. Clara sat up quickly, wiping her face. "I'm fine. Go back to bed." "Are you crying?" "No." "You are. I can hear it." Clara sighed. "All right. Yes. I'm crying. But it's not because anything's wrong. Sometimes people just need to cry." Caleb stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then slowly, he walked across the room and sat on the edge of her bed. "When my ma died," he said quietly, "I didn't cry for a week. I don't know why. I couldn't. And then one night I was lying in the wagon with Rose, and she was asleep, and I just started crying, and I couldn't stop." "What did you do?" "Nothing. Just cried until I was done. Pa was already sick by then. Didn't even notice." Clara reached out and put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. "It's okay to cry," she said, "no matter how long it takes. There's no right way to do it. Rose cries all the time. Rose is 5, and she lost everything. If she needs to cry, she should cry." "What about you? What did you lose?" The question was so direct, so painfully perceptive, that Clara almost laughed. "Everything," she said honestly. "But I'm finding some things again, like you and Rose and Gideon, and this cabin that smells like pine and wet wool." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it, "I'm glad you came." Clara's throat tightened. "Yeah? Yeah, you're good at being here. Better than I thought you'd be." "That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me." Caleb stood up. "Don't tell Rose I said that. She'll get ideas." "Your secret's safe." He walked to the door, then paused. "Good night, Clara." "Not Miss Clara, just Clara." "Good night, Caleb." When he was gone, Clara lay back down and stared at the ceiling. Her face was still wet, but she was smiling. This strange, broken, patchwork family they were building, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was real. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. Spring came late to the mountains that year, arriving in fits and starts like it couldn't quite make up its mind. The snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and mud that sucked at boots and made every trip to the creek an ordeal. The cabin stopped being quite so cold, but now it leaked, water dripping through the roof in 3 different places until Gideon spent 2 full days up there patching holes with tar and old shingles. By then, Caleb had turned 9. He'd grown 3 inches over the winter, shooting up so fast his pants stopped fitting and Clara had to let out the hems twice. He was quieter than he'd been those first weeks, less defensive, though he still watched Clara sometimes like he expected her to vanish if he looked away too long. Rose had stopped having nightmares every night. Now it was only 3 or 4 times a week, and when she woke up crying, she called for Clara instead of Caleb. Clara would go to her, sit on the edge of the bed, and wait until Rose cried herself back to sleep. She never tried to hold her unless Rose reached for her first. Some nights Rose did. Some nights she didn't. Gideon had relaxed too, though he still slept by the stove. He and Clara had fallen into an easy rhythm. Not quite friendship, not quite partnership, something in between that didn't have a name. They worked together without talking much, communicating in gestures and half-finished sentences. He'd bring in firewood without being asked. She'd have coffee ready when he came back from checking traps. Small things that added up to something bigger. It was almost peaceful. And then Caleb rode into town alone one Saturday morning in early May and came back with his face swollen and his knuckles split open. Clara was hanging laundry when she heard the horse. She looked up and saw Caleb sliding off the saddle, moving slow and careful like everything hurt. Her stomach dropped. "Caleb." She dropped the shirt she was holding and crossed the yard. "What happened?" "Nothing." "That's not nothing." She grabbed his chin gently, turning his face to the light. His left eye was turning purple. His bottom lip was split. There was dried blood under his nose. Who did this to you? Nobody? Caleb? I said it's nothing. He jerked away from her, his eyes hot with anger and shame. Just leave it alone. He stormed into the cabin before she could stop him. Clara stood there for a moment, her hands shaking. Then she followed him inside. Caleb had gone straight to the corner where he slept, throwing himself onto his bedroll and turning his face to the wall. Rose was sitting at the table, her eyes wide. What happened to Caleb? She asked in a small voice. I don't know yet, Clara said. She walked over to Caleb and sat down beside him. But I'm going to find out. Caleb, look at me. No. Please. I said no. Clara took a breath. Let it out. Fine. You don't have to look at me, but you do have to tell me what happened, because if someone in town is hurting children, I need to know about it. Silence. Was it an adult? Clara asked quietly. No. Another kid? Caleb's shoulders tensed. That was answer enough. What did they say to you? Doesn't matter. It does to me. Caleb rolled over suddenly, his face twisted with anger. They said you're not my real ma. They said you only married Gideon because you felt sorry for us, and that you're going to leave as soon as you get tired of pretending to care. They said... His voice cracked. They said we're charity cases, and nobody actually wants us. Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. Who said that? The Miller boys, all three of them. They cornered me outside the general store and... He stopped, his jaw working. I told them to shut up. They didn't, so I hit Thomas, the oldest one, and then his brothers jumped me. 3 against 1. Yeah. Did you get any good hits in? Caleb blinked, surprised by the question. Yeah. I broke Thomas's nose. Good. Clara stood up. Stay here. I'll get some water and a cloth for your face. She walked to the bucket by the stove, aware of Caleb watching her with confusion. You're not mad? He asked. Oh, I'm furious, Clara said calmly. She wrung out a cloth and brought it back to him. But not at you. Here. This is going to sting. She pressed the cloth to his split lip. He winced, but didn't pull away. Those boys had no right to say those things, Clara continued, her voice low and fierce. None. And they especially had no right to corner you 3-on-1 like cowards. So no, I'm not mad at you for defending yourself. I'm mad at them for being cruel little shits who don't know when to keep their mouths shut. Clara said a bad word, Rose whispered, delighted. Yes, I did. Don't repeat it. Clara dabbed at the blood under Caleb's nose. Did anyone else see what happened? Mr. Pike came out of the saloon and broke it up. He told the Miller boys to get lost, and he told me to come home. Did he say anything else? He said... Caleb hesitated. He said the Millers are trouble, and I should stay away from them. Clara's hand stilled on his face. The Millers. That's the family Gideon mentioned once, right? The wealthy ones who own half the town. Yeah, their pa owns the lumber mill and the feed store and a bunch of land. They think they're better than everyone. And their boys go around beating up children? Just the ones they don't like. Clara pulled the cloth away and looked at Caleb's battered face. You're going to have a black eye for a week, maybe 2. Your lip will heal faster if you don't pick at it. I know. She stood up, her mind already working. When your pa gets back, we're going to tell him what happened. All of it. And then we're going to figure out what to do. There's nothing to do, Caleb said bitterly. The Millers run this town. Nobody's going to do anything about their kids beating people up. We'll see about that. Gideon came home an hour later with 2 rabbits and a string of brook trout. He took one look at Caleb's face and went very still. What happened? Clara told him. Everything. The Miller boys, the things they'd said, the fight. Caleb tried to interrupt a few times, downplaying it, but Clara spoke over him until the full story was out. When she finished, Gideon was quiet for a long time. He set down the rabbits and the fish very carefully, and then he walked over to where Caleb was sitting. Did you throw the first punch? He asked. Yes, sir. Did you warn them first? Caleb hesitated. I told Thomas to shut his mouth. Twice. And then he kept talking. Yes, sir. Gideon nodded slowly. Then you did the right thing. Caleb's head snapped up. I did? A man's got a right to defend his family's honor, Gideon said. Those boys were talking trash about Clara and about you and Rose. You gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it. That's on them, not you. But there were 3 of them. I know, and that's why we're going into town tomorrow to have a talk with their father. Clara straightened. Gideon, no. His voice was firm. I've let the Millers run roughshod over this town for too long, acting like they own the place just because they've got money. But they don't own my family, and they sure as hell don't get to beat up my boy without answering for it. The words hung in the air. My boy. Caleb's face did something complicated, surprise and hope and fear all tangled together. What if it makes things worse? Clara asked quietly. It might, Gideon admitted, but doing nothing definitely will. Those boys need to learn there are consequences, and their father needs to learn that not everyone in this town is going to bow down just because his pockets are deep. He looked at Caleb. You did good today. Stood up for yourself and for this family. That takes guts. But tomorrow you let me handle the talking. Understood? Caleb nodded, something like pride flickering across his bruised face. Yes, sir. They rode into Aspen Ridge the next morning, all 4 of them. Clara had argued against bringing Rose, but Gideon insisted. We're a family, he said simply. We face things together. The town was quiet when they arrived, just a few people moving between buildings in the mid-morning sun. Gideon tied the horse outside the Miller lumber office, a 2-story building on the main street that dwarfed everything around it. Wait here, he told Clara and the children. Not a chance, Clara said. We're going in together. Gideon looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Clara's expression stopped him. He nodded once and pushed open the door. The office was all dark wood and expensive furniture, designed to impress and intimidate. A clerk sat at a desk near the front, a thin man with spectacles who looked up nervously as they entered. Can I help you? I'm here to see Samuel Miller, Gideon said. Do you have an appointment? No. But he's going to want to see me anyway. Tell him Gideon Holt is here about what his boys did to my son yesterday. The clerk's face went pale. He scurried through a door at the back, and a moment later, a voice boomed from inside. Send them in. Samuel Miller was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with silver hair and a face that was used to getting what it wanted. He sat behind a massive oak desk like a king on a throne, his fingers steepled in front of him. Mr. Holt, he said. His voice was cordial, but his eyes were cold. I heard there was some trouble yesterday between our boys. Trouble, Gideon repeated flatly. That's one word for it. 3-on-1 beating is another. From what I understand, your boys started it. From what I understand, your boys were running their mouths and wouldn't stop when asked. Miller's expression didn't change. Boys will be boys, Mr. Holt. They say things. They scrap. That's part of growing up. Not when it's 3 against 1, Claire said sharply. Everyone looked at her. And not when the things they're saying are designed to be cruel. Miller's eyes moved to Clara, assessing her. You must be the new wife. I heard about that arrangement. Very convenient timing. The implication in his tone made Clara's blood boil, but she kept her voice level. The timing was necessary, but that's not why we're here. Then why are you here? Miller leaned back in his chair. Because if you're expecting an apology from my boys, you're going to be disappointed. They were defending themselves against an attack. They were 3 against 1, Gideon said. That's not defense, that's cowardice. Miller's face darkened. Be very careful with your words, Mr. Holt. Or what? Gideon took a step forward. You'll have your boys jump me too? 3-on-1 seems to be their style. I think you should leave. We'll leave when I'm done talking. Gideon's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of iron. Your boys cornered my son and beat him bloody. I don't care what words were said beforehand. That behavior stops now. If they come near Caleb again, if they so much as look at him wrong, there will be consequences. Miller stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Are you threatening me? I'm stating a fact. You keep your boys away from my family, and we won't have any problems. My boys have every right to walk the streets of this town. So does mine, Gideon cut him off. And he's going to, without fear, without being jumped by 3 cowards who fight in packs. Miller's jaw worked. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually throw a punch. Then he seemed to get control of himself. Get out of my office, he said coldly. Gladly. Gideon turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing. If I hear about any retaliation, if your boys or anyone else in this town gives my family trouble because of this conversation, I'm coming back. And next time, I won't be nearly as polite. They walked out into the bright morning sun. Clara's hands were shaking, but she kept them hidden in the folds of her skirt. Rose was gripping her other hand so tight it hurt. That went well, Caleb muttered. It went exactly how I expected, Gideon said. He lifted Caleb onto the horse, then rose. Miller's used to people backing down. We didn't. That matters. Or it just made everything worse, Clara said quietly. Gideon looked at her. Maybe. But what was the alternative? Let those boys think they can beat up Caleb whenever they feel like it? Teach them that being rich means you can do whatever you want without consequences? Clara didn't have an answer for that. They rode out of town in silence, the mountains rising around them like walls. For 3 weeks, nothing happened. The Millers stayed away. Caleb's bruises faded. Life returned to its normal rhythm, trapping, cooking, cleaning, teaching Rose her letters while Caleb learned to help Gideon with the heavier work around the cabin. Clara started to think maybe it was over. She should have known better. It was late May when everything went to hell. Gideon had taken Caleb into town to trade pelts and buy supplies. Clara was home with Rose, teaching her how to knead bread dough, when they heard horses. 3 riders came into the clearing fast and hard, their horses kicking up dirt. Clara's stomach dropped when she recognized the badges on their coats. The sheriff and 2 deputies. She stepped outside, pulling Rose behind her. Can I help you, gentlemen? The sheriff, a jowly man named Kendricks, who'd always struck Clara as being more politician than lawman, dismounted heavily. Mrs. Holt, where's your boy? In town with my husband. Why? Because there's been an incident. Kendricks pulled a piece of paper from his coat. I have a warrant for his arrest. The world tilted. What? Caleb Holt is accused of assault. We're here to take him into custody. Clara's mind raced. Assault? Who's accusing him? Thomas Miller claims your boy attacked him at the creek yesterday afternoon, broke his jaw. That's impossible. Caleb was here yesterday all day. We were repairing the chicken coop. Kendrick's expression didn't change. That's not what Thomas says. He says Caleb jumped him while he was fishing. Witnesses saw it. What witnesses? Thomas's brothers. Of course. Clara felt cold rage building in her chest. So the same boys who jumped Caleb 3 weeks ago are now claiming he attacked one of them? And you believe that? I believe what the witnesses say, Kendricks said. And I have a warrant. Now where's the boy? I told you. He's in town. Then we'll wait. The 3 men settled in, tying their horses and making themselves comfortable in the yard like they had all the time in the world. Clara stood on the porch with Rose pressed against her side, her mind spinning. This was a setup. It had to be. The Millers were retaliating for what Gideon had said in Samuel Miller's office. They'd concocted some story, gotten their boys to lie, and now they were using the law to punish Caleb. And there was nothing Clara could do to stop it. Gideon and Caleb returned 2 hours later. Clara saw Gideon's face change the moment he spotted the sheriff's horses. He brought his own horse to a stop at the edge of the clearing, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Don't! Clara called out. They have a warrant. Kendrick stood up, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Gideon Holt, I need to speak with your boy. About what? Gideon's voice was dangerously quiet. About an assault that took place yesterday at Blackstone Creek. Thomas Miller claims Caleb attacked him without provocation and broke his jaw. That's a lie, Gideon said immediately. You got proof? Caleb was here all day yesterday, working with me. Can anyone else verify that? Gideon's jaw tightened. My wife can. Your wife who just married you a few months ago? Kendricks shook his head. No offense, Mrs. Holt, but that ain't exactly an unbiased witness. So you'll take the word of the Miller boys, who already beat up Caleb once, over the word of his parents? Clara's voice was sharp. That's convenient. I'm taking the word of 3 witnesses against the word of 2 people who have every reason to lie for the accused. Kendricks looked at Caleb, who'd gone pale and still on the horse. Son, I need you to come with me. No, Gideon said. It's not a request. I don't care. You're not taking him. Kendrick's hand tightened on his gun. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Gideon. The boy needs to answer for what he did. He didn't do anything. Then he can tell that to the judge. Kendricks took a step forward. Now we can do this easy, or we can do it hard. Your choice. For a long, terrible moment, Clara thought Gideon was going to go for his rifle. His whole body was tense, coiled like a spring. Caleb was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. Then Clara spoke. We'll bring him in ourselves. Everyone looked at her. What? Gideon said. We'll bring Caleb into town ourselves, Clara repeated. She walked down from the porch, forcing herself to stay calm. You have a warrant for his arrest, fine. We're not going to resist, but we're not letting you drag him away in chains like he's some kind of criminal. We'll ride in together, as a family, and Caleb will face whatever charges you're bringing. Kendrick studied her. You got 24 hours. If he's not in my jail by noon tomorrow, I'm coming back with a posse. He'll be there, Clara said. Kendricks nodded slowly. He mounted his horse, the deputies following suit. Noon tomorrow, Mrs. Holt. Don't make me regret this. They rode out, leaving dust and dread in their wake. The moment they were gone, Gideon was off his horse and pulling Caleb down. You all right? Caleb nodded, but he was shaking. I didn't do it. I swear I didn't. I wasn't anywhere near Blackstone Creek yesterday. I was here. You know I was here. I know, Gideon said fiercely. I know you didn't do it. This is the Millers. They're lying. Then what do we do? Caleb's voice cracked. If they're lying and the sheriff believes them, what do we do? Clara walked over and put her hand on his shoulder. We go to town. We face the judge. We tell the truth. And if the judge doesn't believe us? Clara didn't have an answer for that. None of them did. That night, the cabin was too quiet. Rose had picked up on the tension and kept asking questions nobody wanted to answer. Caleb sat in the corner, his face blank, like he'd gone somewhere inside himself where the fear couldn't reach. Gideon paced like a caged animal. Clara made dinner that nobody ate. She cleaned dishes that didn't need cleaning. She tried to think of something, anything they could do to prove Caleb's innocence, but she kept hitting the same wall. It was their word against the Millers. 3 witnesses against 2. Money and power against a mountain family that barely existed in the eyes of the town. Around midnight, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Gideon spoke. We could run. Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. What? We could leave tonight. Head deeper into the mountains. There's places the law won't follow. Places we could disappear. For how long? As long as we need to. Gideon, Clara set down the sock. We can't run. If we run, Caleb looks guilty, and we'll spend the rest of our lives hiding. Is that what you want for him? For Rose? I want them safe, Gideon said roughly. I want them away from people like the Millers, who think they can destroy a kid's life just because they have money and connections. So do I. But running isn't the answer. Then what is? Clara took a breath. We fight. We go into that courthouse tomorrow and we tell the truth, and we make them hear it. And if they don't listen, then we figure out what comes next. But we don't run. We don't give the Millers the satisfaction. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, exhaustion written across his face. All right, we fight. They left for town at dawn, all 4 of them on horseback. The ride took 3 hours, and nobody spoke. Caleb stared straight ahead, his face pale. Rose kept looking back at the mountains like she was trying to memorize them. Gideon's jaw was set so tight Clara could see the muscles jumping. Clara prayed, not to anyone in particular, just throwing desperate thoughts into the universe, that somehow, someway, this would turn out all right. But she'd learned a long time ago that prayer and hope were different things, and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. The courthouse in Aspen Ridge was barely more than a converted meeting hall with a judge's bench at one end and rough wooden benches for spectators. By the time the Holt family arrived at 11:30, the room was already packed. Word had spread fast. A mountain family taking on the Millers was the kind of spectacle nobody wanted to miss. Clara held Rose's hand as they walked down the center aisle. She could feel every eye in the room tracking them, could hear the whispers following in their wake. Caleb walked between her and Gideon, his spine straight, his face carefully blank. He'd gotten good at hiding fear over the past months. Too good for a 9-year-old. The Miller family sat in the front row on the right side. Samuel Miller in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Gideon made in a year, his wife beside him in silk and pearls, and their 3 sons lined up like soldiers. Thomas, the oldest, had his jaw wrapped in bandages. When he saw Caleb, he smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Clara want to hit something. Sheriff Kendrick stood near the judge's bench, talking quietly with a thin man in a black coat, who Clara assumed was the territorial prosecutor. Neither of them looked their way. "Where do we sit?" Rose whispered. "Left side," Gideon said quietly. "Near the front." They settled onto a bench that creaked under Gideon's weight. Clara pulled Rose onto her lap even though the girl was getting too big for it. She needed the contact, needed to feel something solid and real. Across the aisle, Samuel Miller was watching them with an expression that might have been satisfaction or contempt. Probably both. The side door opened and Judge Harriman walked in. He was older than Clara had expected, maybe 70, with white hair and a face carved into permanent lines by decades of frontier justice. He moved slowly, like his joints hurt, but his eyes were sharp when they swept across the courtroom. "All rise," Kendrick said. Everyone stood. The judge settled into his chair with a grunt and gestured for them to sit. "We're here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of the territory versus Caleb Holt," Harriman said. His voice was rough but clear. "Charged with assault resulting in serious bodily harm. Mr. Brennan, you're prosecuting?" The thin man in black stood. "Yes, Your Honor. The territory will show that on the afternoon of May 23rd, the defendant attacked Thomas Miller without provocation at Blackstone Creek, striking him multiple times and breaking his jaw. And the defendant is 9 years old," Judge Harriman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Honor, but age doesn't excuse violence." "Didn't say it did, just establishing facts." Harriman looked at Gideon. "You representing the boy?" Gideon stood awkwardly. "I'm his father, Your Honor. We can't afford a lawyer." "Didn't ask if you could afford one. Asked if you're representing him." "Yes, sir, I am. Sit down." Harriman shuffled some papers on his desk. "Mr. Brennan, call your first witness." "The territory calls Thomas Miller." Thomas stood and walked to the witness chair like he'd practiced it. He probably had. Clara watched him settle in, watched him glance at his father for approval before the prosecutor even asked the first question. "State your name for the record," Brennan said. "Thomas Arthur Miller." "How old are you, Thomas?" 14, sir. "And do you know the defendant, Caleb Holt?" "Yes, sir." Thomas's eyes flicked to Caleb. "We go to the same town. I've seen him around. Tell us what happened on the afternoon of May 23rd. Thomas took a breath, putting on a show of reluctance. "I was fishing at Blackstone Creek. It's a spot I go to sometimes when I want to be alone. I had my line in the water when Caleb came out of nowhere and he started hitting me." "Did he say anything?" "He said," Thomas hesitated, like the memory pained him. "He said I needed to pay for what my brothers and me did to him a few weeks back. Then he swung at my face." "Did you fight back?" "I tried to defend myself, but he was like a wild animal, just kept hitting me. I fell down and he kept going. If my brothers hadn't heard me yelling and come running, I don't know what would have happened." "Your brothers witnessed the assault?" "Yes, sir. They pulled him off me." Brennan nodded slowly, letting that sink in. "And what injuries did you sustain?" "Broken jaw. Doctor says it'll take months to heal right. I can barely eat solid food." "Thank you, Thomas." And Brennan turned to Gideon. "Your witness." Gideon stood. Clara could see his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the back of the bench in front of him. He'd never questioned a witness in his life, never stood in a courtroom, never had to fight this kind of battle with words instead of fists. "You said Caleb came out of nowhere," Gideon said. "Yes, sir. But Blackstone Creek is 15 miles from my cabin, and there's only one trail that leads there from my place. You're saying you didn't see or hear him coming?" Thomas blinked. I was focused on fishing. Awful focused if you didn't hear someone walking through the woods for 15 miles. "Objection," Brennan said. "Argumentative." "Sustained," Judge Harriman said. "Ask a question, Mr. Holt." Gideon cleared his throat. "What time did this happen?" "Around 3 in the afternoon." "You sure about that?" "Pretty sure." "Because at 3 in the afternoon on May 23rd, Caleb was at home with me. We were repairing the chicken coop. I can show you the work we did if you want proof." "Your Honor," Brennan cut in, "the defense can present his own testimony later. This is cross-examination. He's right, Harriman said. Stick to questions about what the witness saw, Mr. Holt. Gideon's jaw worked. When Caleb supposedly attacked you, what was he wearing? Thomas hesitated. I don't remember. You don't remember what someone was wearing when they broke your jaw? It happened fast. I wasn't paying attention to his clothes. What about his face? You remember that? Of course. Did he have any marks on him? Any bruises from the fight you and your brothers gave him 3 weeks earlier? Thomas's expression flickered. I don't know what you're talking about. Really? Because Pike from the Saloon broke up a fight where you and your 2 brothers beat up Caleb 3-on-1 outside the general store. He saw the whole thing. That was different, Thomas said quickly. We were just messing around. Messing around, Gideon repeated. Is that what you call 3 boys jumping one? Objection, Brennan was on his feet. Your Honor, this is completely irrelevant. It's relevant to motive, Gideon shot back. He's claiming Caleb attacked him for revenge. But the truth is, his family's been after my boy since we had words with his father about how his sons beat up a 9-year-old. That's a lie. Samuel Miller stood up in the front row. My boys did no such thing. Judge Harriman slammed his gavel down so hard it cracked. Mr. Miller, sit down and shut your mouth or I'll have you removed. This is my courtroom, not your lumber office. He waited until Samuel sat, his face purple with rage. Mr. Holt, you're treading a thin line here. Make your point or move on. Gideon turned back to Thomas. You and your brothers have it out for Caleb. You jumped him once, and when my family complained about it, you decided to get back at us by making up this story. That's what really happened, isn't it? No, he attacked me. My brothers saw it. Your brothers who've already proven they'll gang up on a kid half their size. Your Honor, Brennan started. I'm done, Gideon said. He sat down heavily, his hands still shaking. Brennan stood again. The territory calls Robert Miller. The middle brother took the stand. He was 12, stocky, with the same self-satisfied expression as Thomas. His testimony matched his brother's almost word for word. Too perfectly, Clara thought. Like they'd rehearsed it. He described hearing Thomas yell, running to the creek, finding Caleb on top of his brother throwing punches. Did you see how the fight started? Brennan asked. No, sir. We just heard Thomas yelling and came running. So you didn't actually see Caleb throw the first punch? No, but Thomas told us what happened. Gideon stood for cross-examination. You said you and your younger brother came running when you heard Thomas yell. Where were you when you heard him? We were walking along the ridge above the creek. What were you doing up there? Just walking, looking around. All 3 of you just happened to be at Blackstone Creek at the same time? Robert shifted in his seat. We go there sometimes. It's a good fishing spot. But you weren't fishing. You were walking on the ridge. We were going to fish. We just hadn't gotten there yet. So you were going to fish, but instead of going to the creek where the fish are, you were walking on the ridge 100 feet above it. We were looking for the best spot. Gideon stared at him for a long moment. You're lying. Objection. Brennan was up again. Withdrawn, Gideon said. I'm done with this witness. The youngest Miller brother testified next. His story matched the others, but he was 11 and clearly nervous. He stammered through his answers, kept looking at his father for reassurance. When Gideon asked him to describe exactly what he saw when he reached the creek, the boy got details wrong. Said Caleb was wearing a blue shirt when Caleb had been wearing gray, said the fight happened near a fallen log when Thomas had testified it was by the water. Small inconsistencies, but they were there. When the prosecution rested, Judge Harriman looked at Gideon. Defense? Gideon stood. I call Clara Holt. Clara's heart hammered as she stood and walked to the witness chair. She'd known this was coming, but that didn't make it easier. She could feel the entire courtroom watching her, judging her. The woman who'd married Gideon overnight, the convenient wife, the biased witness. Brennan didn't even wait for Gideon to start questioning. Your Honor, I object to this witness. She's the defendant's stepmother and has every reason to lie on his behalf. And the prosecution's witnesses are the victim and his brothers, who have every reason to lie against the defendant, Gideon countered. You can't have it both ways. Judge Harriman sighed. Overruled. I'll hear what she has to say. But Mrs. Holt, understand that I'm going to weigh your testimony with appropriate skepticism. I understand, Your Honor, Clara said quietly. Gideon approached her. Clara, where was Caleb on the afternoon of May 23rd? At home with us, all day. We were working on repairs to the chicken coop. What time did you start working? Right after breakfast, around 8 in the morning. And you're certain Caleb was there the entire time? Completely certain. He was hammering new boards while Gideon and I replaced the wire mesh. We worked straight through until evening. Did he leave the property at any point? No, he was in our sight the whole time. Brennan stood for cross-examination, his expression skeptical. Mrs. Holt, you married Gideon Holt in January of this year. Is that correct? Yes. And that marriage took place rather suddenly, didn't it? In the middle of the night? We married at midnight, yes. It was sudden because it was necessary. Necessary because of the children. Yes. So you have a vested interest in keeping this family together. Clara's hands tightened on the armrest. I have an interest in telling the truth. The truth as you see it, but the fact remains that you married into this family specifically to keep these children out of an orphanage. If Caleb is convicted, that arrangement falls apart, doesn't it? That's not... Objection, Gideon said. He's badgering the witness. I'm establishing bias, Brennan said smoothly. He's established it, Judge Harriman said. Move on, Mr. Brennan. Brennan turned back to Clara. Have you ever been to Blackstone Creek? No. So you don't know how long it takes to get there from your cabin. Gideon says it's about 2 hours on horseback. But you don't know for certain. No. So it's possible Caleb could have left your property, ridden to Blackstone Creek, attacked Thomas Miller, and returned without you noticing. No, Clara said firmly. It's not possible. He was with us all day. You're absolutely certain. Yes. Mrs. Holt, you've been part of this family for 4 months. 4 months. And you expect this court to believe that you can account for a 9-year-old boy's whereabouts every single minute of every single day? Clara met his eyes. On May 23rd? Yes, I can. Because we were working together, and he was in my sight from morning until night. Brennan studied her, looking for cracks. Finding none, he nodded. No further questions. Gideon called himself to the stand next. He testified about the chicken coop repairs, about the work he and Caleb had done, about the fact that Caleb had been home all day. Brennan tried to shake his testimony the same way he'd tried with Clara, but Gideon held firm. When the defense rested, Judge Harriman sat back in his chair. Anything else? The territory rests, Your Honor, Brennan said. Defense rests, Gideon said. Harriman looked at Caleb for a long moment. Son, stand up. Caleb stood, his face pale. Did you attack Thomas Miller at Blackstone Creek on May 23rd? No, sir, Caleb said. His voice was steady, but Clara could see his hands shaking. I was home with my parents all day. I didn't go anywhere near Blackstone Creek. You understand what's at stake here? If I believe you did this, you're looking at time in a work camp, maybe years, depending on how I rule. I understand, sir, but I'm telling the truth. I didn't do it. Harriman nodded slowly. Sit down. The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Harriman steepled his fingers, his face unreadable. The seconds stretched into minutes. Claire could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Finally, Harriman spoke. This is a hard case, he said. On one hand, we've got 3 witnesses claiming they saw the defendant commit assault. On the other hand, we've got 2 witnesses claiming he was somewhere else entirely. Usually in a case like this, I'd side with the majority. 3 witnesses against 2. Samuel Miller leaned forward, a small smile playing at his lips. But, Harriman continued, I've been a judge in this territory for 26 years, and in those 26 years, I've learned to tell the difference between testimony that's truthful and testimony that's convenient. The smile disappeared from Samuel's face. The Miller boys' testimony was too clean, Harriman said, too rehearsed. 3 separate witnesses telling the same story in almost the same words. That doesn't happen naturally. That happens when people coordinate their lies. He looked at Thomas. And the inconsistencies in the youngest boy's testimony tell me that at least one of them isn't sure what he's supposed to say. Your Honor, Brennan started, the inconsistencies were minor. They were enough, Harriman said. Combined with the fact that these same boys have a documented history of violence against the defendant, and combined with the timing of this accusation coming right after the defendant's father confronted Samuel Miller about that violence, he He shook his head. This smells like retaliation, and I won't convict a 9-year-old boy based on testimony I don't trust. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Beside her, Gideon had gone very still. However, Harriman continued, and the hope that had started to bloom in Clara's chest withered. I also can't ignore the fact that Thomas Miller's jaw is broken. Someone did that, and whether it was this defendant or not, the question remains. If violence was used, was it justified? He turned to Caleb again. Son, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. In your entire life, have you ever hit anyone? Caleb's throat worked. The courtroom waited. Yes, sir, he said quietly. I hit Thomas Miller once, about a month ago, outside the general store. Why'd you hit him? Caleb glanced at Rose, then back at the judge. Because he and his brothers were saying things about my family, bad things. I asked them to stop. They didn't, so I hit Thomas. And then his brothers joined in and beat you up. Yes, sir. How'd that make you feel? Angry and scared. Scared enough to want revenge? Caleb shook his head. No, sir. Scared enough to stay away from them. Harriman leaned forward. Here's what I'm struggling with, son. If you wanted to stay away from them, why would you ride all the way to Blackstone Creek, a place you've never been, just to attack Thomas? That doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because I didn't do it, Caleb said. I don't even know where Blackstone Creek is. Harriman sat back. The silence stretched again. Then he spoke, and his words fell like stones into still water. Did you try to be kind? The question was so unexpected that it took Clara a moment to understand it. Beside her, Gideon went rigid. Caleb blinked. What? When you hit Thomas that first time, before his brothers jumped you, did you try to be kind first? Did you give him a chance to walk away? Caleb's face went through several emotions. Yes, sir. I told him twice to stop talking. He didn't, so I hit him. You warned him. Yes, sir. And when his brothers were beating you up, did you fight back? I tried, but there were 3 of them. I imagine there were. Harriman looked at Thomas. And I imagine that kind of thing, 3 boys ganging up on one, might make a person want revenge. But here's the thing. He turned back to Caleb. You're not asking me to believe you didn't want revenge. You're asking me to believe you didn't take it. That's a much harder thing for a boy your age to do. I know, sir, Caleb said quietly. But I didn't, because He hesitated. Because my pa taught me that fighting's only okay when someone's in danger, and nobody was in danger at Blackstone Creek, because I wasn't there. Your pa taught you that? Yes, sir. Harriman looked at Gideon. You teach him anything else? Gideon stood. I teach him to keep his word, Your Honor. I teach him to protect his family. And I teach him that 3-on-1 isn't fighting, it's cowardice. That last one's pretty specific. It came up recently. Harriman almost smiled. Almost. Then his face went serious again. Mr. Brennan, I'm dismissing the charges. The courtroom erupted. Samuel Miller was on his feet, shouting. You can't do that. We have witnesses, 3 of them. I can do whatever I want, Harriman said calmly. This is my courtroom, and I've made my ruling. The charges are dismissed. This is corruption. You're letting him off because... Sheriff, Harriman said, remove Mr. Miller from my courtroom. Kendricks moved toward Samuel, but Samuel was already storming toward the door, his family scrambling after him. Thomas shot one last hateful look at Caleb before disappearing outside. When they were gone, the courtroom slowly emptied. People filed out, whispering, shooting glances at the Holt family. Clara sat frozen, unable to quite believe what had just happened. You're free to go, Judge Harriman said to Caleb. But son, come here for a minute. Caleb walked to the bench on shaking legs. Harriman leaned down. I don't know if you did it or not, he said quietly, and that's going to bother me for a long time. But I do know the Miller boys are lying about something. Maybe it's the whole story. Maybe it's just parts of it. But I'm not sending a 9-year-old to a work camp based on lies. He paused. That said, you need to be careful. The Millers are powerful. They're angry. And this isn't over. I understand, sir. Do you? Harriman's eyes were sharp. Because from where I'm sitting, you're a kid caught in the middle of something bigger than you. Your pa kicked a hornet's nest when he confronted Samuel Miller. Now the hornets are swarming, and they don't care who gets stung. Caleb swallowed hard. What should I do? Stay close to your family, Harriman said. Stay away from town when you can. And if those boys come after you again, run. Don't fight. Just run. Yes, sir. Harriman straightened up, addressing all of them now. Get out of town. Go home. And Mr. Holt, Gideon looked up. Next time you want to confront someone like Samuel Miller, maybe think twice. You've got kids to think about now. Kids who don't need their father making enemies with the most powerful man in the county. Noted, Your Honor, Gideon said, but there was steel in his voice that said he'd do the same thing again if he had to. They walked out of the courthouse into bright afternoon sun. The street was quiet, but Clara could see people watching from windows, from doorways. News was already spreading. The Mountain family had gone up against the Millers and walked away free. That should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something worse. They rode out of town in silence. Nobody spoke for the first hour, too wrung out by tension and fear and relief to form words. Rose had fallen asleep against Clara's chest. Caleb rode with Gideon, his head down, lost in his own thoughts. It wasn't until they were deep in the mountains, with Aspen Ridge far behind them, that Gideon finally spoke. That was too close. I know, Clara said. If Harriman had believed the Miller boys, but he didn't. This time. Gideon's hands tightened on the reins. Next time we might not be so lucky. Then we make sure there's no next time, Clara said. We keep our heads down. We stay out of town unless we absolutely have to go. We don't give them any excuse to come after us again. Gideon nodded, but his face was troubled. That night, after the children were asleep, Clara found Gideon outside staring at the stars. She walked over and stood beside him. You did good today, she said quietly. I almost lost him. But you didn't. Because of a judge who decided to trust his gut instead of the evidence. That's not a system I can rely on, Clara. That's luck. And luck runs out. Clara didn't have an answer for that. He was right. They'd gotten lucky. And in a world where the Millers had money and power and connections, luck was a thin shield. We should leave, Gideon said suddenly. Pack up. Head deeper into the mountains. Or west, maybe. Oregon territory. Somewhere the Millers can't reach. No. He looked at her, surprised. We're not running, Clara said. This is our home. We've built something here. The kids are settled. We're not throwing that away because one powerful family wants to make our lives difficult. They're going to keep coming after us. Maybe. Probably. But if we run now, we teach Caleb and Rose that when things get hard, you give up. That when people with power push you, you fall down and stay down. Clara turned to face him fully. Is that what you want to teach them? I want to keep them safe. So do I. But safety isn't just about avoiding danger. It's about teaching them how to stand their ground, how to face hard things without breaking. Gideon was quiet for a long time. You're braver than I am. I'm angrier than you are, Clara corrected. I spent 6 years being afraid, being small, letting life happen to me instead of making my own choices. I'm done with that. And I'm not going to let the Millers or anyone else make me go back to being that person. She walked back toward the cabin, leaving Gideon alone with the stars and his thoughts. Inside, she checked on the children. Caleb was still awake, staring at the ceiling. Can't sleep? Clara asked softly. No. She sat on the edge of his bed. You did good today, too, telling the truth even though you were scared. I'm still scared. I know. Me too. Caleb looked at her. The judge asked me if I tried to be kind. That's what you asked Gideon, the night you agreed to marry him. I remember. Why'd you ask that? Clara thought about how to answer. Because kindness matters more than almost anything else. It's easy to be cruel, easy to be selfish, but choosing to be kind, especially when you're scared or hurt or angry, that takes real strength. Is that why you came here? To be kind? Partly. And partly because I needed someone to be kind to me. Caleb was quiet for a moment, then so softly she almost missed it. I'm glad you came. Clara's throat tightened. Me too. She sat with him until he fell asleep, then made her way to her own bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The Millers weren't going to forget. The town wasn't going to stop talking. Life was going to stay hard and complicated and unfair. But tonight, her family was safe. Tonight, that was enough. The years that followed the trial moved like water over stone, slow, steady, reshaping everything they touched. Clara had been right about one thing. The Millers didn't forget. For months after the courthouse, the family felt their presence like a shadow. Supplies from the general store were suddenly harder to get, prices mysteriously higher when Gideon tried to buy them. The few neighbors they had in the high country became distant, polite, but careful, like associating with the Holts might bring trouble they couldn't afford. Word had spread that the Mountain family had humiliated Samuel Miller in front of the whole town, and nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire. But the Millers also didn't strike again. Maybe Judge Harriman's dismissal had stung their pride enough to make them cautious. Maybe they'd decided the Mountain family wasn't worth the effort. Or maybe, and Clara suspected this was closer to the truth, they were just waiting for the Holts to make another mistake. So the family learns to be careful. Gideon stopped going to town unless absolutely necessary, and when he did go, he never went alone. Caleb stayed close to the cabin, helping with trap lines and hunting, but never wandering far. Rose grew up knowing that some places were safe and some weren't, and that Aspen Ridge fell firmly in the second category. It was a hard way to live, but it was living. Caleb turned 10, then 11, then 12. He shot up like a weed, all gangly limbs and two big hands, his voice cracking at random moments that made Rose laugh until she cried. He learned to set traps as well as Gideon, learned to track elk through snow, learned to skin a deer without wasting meat. He also learned to read and write under Clara's patient instruction, struggling through the handful of books she'd brought from town until the words stopped swimming on the page and started making sense. Rose turned 6, then 7, then 8. She was fearless in ways that terrified Clara, climbing trees too high, wandering too close to the creek when it ran fast with snowmelt, once trying to pet a fox that had wandered into the clearing until Gideon scooped her up and carried her inside. She had her mother's blonde hair and her father's stubbornness, mixed with something entirely her own that Clara could only describe as wild joy. The nightmares had stopped completely by the time she turned 7. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it had settled into something she could carry instead of something that carried her. And Clara and Gideon, that was the strangest transformation of all. They'd started as strangers bound by legal necessity. Then they'd become something like business partners, running a household with practical efficiency. But somewhere along the way, in the space between morning coffee and evening silence, they'd become friends. It happened in small moments. Gideon fixing the broken handle on Clara's favorite pot without being asked. Clara mending his coat and adding an extra patch on the elbow where it always wore through. The way they could work side by side for hours without speaking and still understand exactly what the other needed. The night Clara woke from a nightmare about Sarah and found Gideon sitting by the stove, unable to sleep, and they'd talked until dawn about loss and grief and how some holes never fill, but you learn to walk around them anyway. They still slept separately, Gideon by the stove, Clara in the bed. But the distance between them had closed in every other way that mattered. 3 years after the trial, in the late summer when Caleb was 12 and Rose was 8, Clara woke one morning to find Gideon standing in the doorway of her room. "Something's wrong," he said. Clara was on her feet immediately. "What?" "Smoke. Coming from the direction of town." She followed him outside. Sure enough, a dark column rose in the distance, thick and black against the blue sky. "That's big," Clara said. Her stomach tightened. "Too big for a cooking fire." "Building fire, maybe. Or—" Gideon's face went pale. "Clara, that's coming from the direction of the Miller lumber mill." They stood there for a long moment, watching the smoke rise. "We should go see if anyone needs help," Clara said finally. "Are you insane? If that's the mill and it's burning, the Millers are going to be looking for someone to blame, and we're their favorite target. All the more reason to show up and help. If we hide up here while the town burns, it just confirms everything they think about us." Gideon looked at her like she'd grown a second head. "You want to help the people who've been making our lives hell for 3 years?" "I want to help the town," Clara corrected. "The people in it who haven't done anything except try to survive. Same as us." "What about the kids?" Clara thought fast. "We bring them. All of us go together. Safety in numbers, and nobody can accuse us of anything if we're in plain sight the whole time." Gideon didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. 20 minutes later, they were riding toward Aspen Ridge, the smoke getting thicker with every mile. The lumber mill was fully engulfed by the time they arrived. Flames shot 50 feet into the air, consuming the main building and spreading to the stacks of cut timber nearby. Half the town had formed a bucket brigade from the creek, passing water hand to hand, but it was clearly useless. The mill was gone. All they could do now was try to stop the fire from spreading to the other buildings. Clara slid off the horse and immediately joined the line, taking a bucket from a woman she vaguely recognized and passing it down. Gideon hesitated, then did the same. Caleb and Rose stayed with the horses, watching wide-eyed as the town fought to save itself. They worked for hours. Clara's arms screamed, her hands blistered, her dress soaked through with creek water and sweat. But she kept passing buckets, kept moving, kept pushing through the exhaustion. Around her, other people were doing the same, shopkeepers and farmers and drifters, all of them too tired to care about old grudges or whose family had humiliated whose in a courthouse 3 years ago. By the time they got the fire contained, the sun was setting and the mill was nothing but smoking rubble. Clara collapsed on the ground, breathing hard, and realized Gideon was sitting next to her in the same state. "We're getting too old for this," he muttered. "We were too old for this when we started." Someone approached, Pike from the Saloon, his face black with soot. "Didn't expect to see you folks here." "Didn't expect the town to catch fire," Gideon said. "Fair point." Pike looked at the ruins of the mill. "Samuel Miller's going to lose his mind when he sees this." "Where is he?" "Denver. Business trip. Won't be back for another week." Pike shook his head. "This is going to bankrupt him. The mill was his biggest operation. Without it, he's got nothing." Clara stood slowly, her legs shaking. "How did it start?" "Nobody knows, but the sheriff's already asking questions, looking for someone to blame." Gideon and Clara exchanged a look. "He's not going to blame us," Clara said. "We were at our cabin. We've got each other as alibis." "You think that's going to matter to Miller?" Pike asked. "Man's going to want blood, and you folks are an easy target." "Then we'll deal with it when it comes," Gideon said, but his voice was tight with worry. They rode home in darkness, the smell of smoke clinging to their clothes. Rose fell asleep in Clara's arms before they were halfway back. Caleb stayed awake, silent and watchful. "We should have stayed home," Gideon said quietly. "No," Clara said. "We did the right thing." "Doing the right thing doesn't always protect you." "No, but it's still right." 2 days later, the sheriff showed up at their cabin with 3 deputies and a face carved from stone. "Gideon Holt," Kendrick said without preamble. "I need to ask you some questions about the fire at the Miller lumber mill." Gideon stepped out onto the porch, putting himself between the sheriff and his family. "Ask. Where were you on the afternoon of August 14th? "Here, at my cabin." "Anyone verify that?" "My wife, my kids." Kendrick's expression didn't change. "That's convenient." "It's also true." "Problem is, we found something in the mill ruins." Kendricks pulled a piece of metal from his coat, a trap spring, twisted and blackened by fire. "This is yours, isn't it?" "Got your mark on the side." Gideon's face went very still. "I make a lot of traps. That could be from any of them." "Except this one was found right where the fire started, like maybe someone used it to prop open a window or set up some kind of timing mechanism." Kendrick stepped closer. "Now, I'm not saying you did it, but I am saying you've got motive. The Millers have been making your life difficult for years. Maybe you decided to return the favor." "I was here," Gideon said through gritted teeth, "all day. I didn't set that fire." "Then how'd your trap end up in the mill?" "I don't know. Maybe someone stole it. Maybe someone's trying to frame me. Did you think of that?" Clara appeared in the doorway. "Sheriff, my husband is telling the truth. He was here all day on August 14th. We were working together to re-roof the barn. You can see the new shingles if you want proof." Kendricks looked at her, then at the barn. The roof did look new, or at least newer than the rest of the structure. "When did you do that work?" he asked. "Started it 3 days before the fire. Finished it the day after," Clara said. "We've got witnesses. Our neighbor 2 miles north came by on the 13th to borrow tools. He saw us working. It was a gamble. They did have a neighbor 2 miles north, an old trapper named Warren, who mostly kept to himself. Whether he'd actually remember stopping by was another question entirely. But Kendricks didn't push. He stared at the barn, at Gideon, at Clara, his jaw working. "I'll check your story," he said finally. "But understand this. If I find out you're lying, I'm coming back with more than questions. I'm coming with chains." He and his deputies mounted up and rode out, leaving silence in their wake. The moment they were out of sight, Gideon turned to Clara. "Warren didn't come by on the 13th. "I know. You lied to the sheriff." "I protected my family." Clara met his eyes. "Someone planted that trap at the mill to frame you. Probably the millers themselves, or someone working for them. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let them destroy us over a lie." "If Kendricks finds out, then we'll deal with it." Clara's voice was hard. "But right now, we need to figure out who's trying to set you up and stop them before they succeed." The answer came faster than they expected. Warren did remember stopping by, not on the 13th, but close enough that when Kendricks asked him about it, he confirmed the general timeline. The sheriff didn't look happy about it, but without proof that Gideon had left the property, he couldn't make an arrest. But the rumors started anyway. Whispers that Gideon had burned down the mill out of revenge, that the Mountain family was dangerous, that Samuel Miller was right to want them gone. Then 2 weeks after the fire, something changed. Caleb was in town with Gideon, against Clara's wishes, but they'd needed supplies and Gideon insisted on keeping the boy close, when Thomas Miller cornered them outside the feed store. Thomas was 17 now, tall and mean, with his father's temper and his mother's cruel streak. He'd grown into the kind of young man who threw his weight around and expected people to scatter. "Heard your pa burned down our mill," Thomas said. He had 2 friends with him, both just as big, just as stupid. "You heard wrong," Caleb said. He was 12, but he'd learned not to back down. "We were nowhere near the mill." "That's not what people are saying." "Then people are liars." Thomas smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "You calling me a liar?" "If the shoe fits." It happened fast. Thomas swung. Caleb ducked. The 2 friends moved in, and suddenly it was 3-on-1 again, just like it had been 3 years ago. Except Caleb wasn't 9 anymore. He was 12, and he'd spent 3 years learning to fight from Gideon, learning where to hit to make it count, learning how to use an opponent's size against them. He broke one boy's nose with an elbow, kicked another in the knee hard enough to drop him, and when Thomas grabbed him from behind, Caleb threw his head back and caught him square in the face. Thomas went down hard, blood streaming from his shattered nose. The street had gone silent. People stared. Someone called for the sheriff. Gideon appeared, pulling Caleb away. "We're leaving, now." But Caleb was staring at Thomas, who was on the ground clutching his face, and for the first time, Clara saw something that scared her. Not fear, not even anger. Satisfaction. They rode back to the cabin with Gideon furious and Caleb silent. Clara took one look at them and knew something had broken. "What happened?" "He fought back," Gideon said. His voice was strange, proud and terrified at the same time. "Thomas jumped him, and he fought back. Took down 3 boys. Clara looked at Caleb. His knuckles were split. His shirt was torn, but his face was calm. "Did you warn them first?" she asked quietly. Caleb met her eyes. "No." "Why not?" "Because I'm tired of warning them. I'm tired of being the one who has to be kind while they get to be cruel. I'm tired of running and hiding and pretending it's okay that they get to make our lives hell just because they have money." "Caleb, I hit him," Caleb said, "and I'm not sorry. I'd do it again." Clara felt something cold settle in her chest. This was the cost of 3 years of fear and isolation and being hunted. This was what happened when you taught a child to survive but forgot to teach him how to stay human in the process. "Go inside," she said quietly. "We'll talk about this later." Caleb walked into the cabin without looking back. That night, Clara found Gideon sitting outside again, staring at nothing. "We failed him," she said. Gideon looked up, surprised. "What?" "We taught him to be strong, to stand his ground, to fight when necessary. But we forgot to teach him when to stop fighting, when to choose something other than violence." "He was defending himself. He said he didn't warn them," Claire interrupted. "He just hit first. That's not defense. That's revenge." Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe he's earned a little revenge. Maybe. But revenge isn't the same as justice. And if we let him think it is, we're raising him to be just like the people we're trying to protect him from. So what do we do?" Clara didn't have an answer. Not yet. The answer came from an unexpected source 2 days later when Judge Harriman himself rode up to their cabin. He was older now, moving slower, but his eyes were still sharp. He dismounted with a grunt and walked straight to where Clara and Gideon were standing on the porch. "I heard about the fight," he said without preamble, "and I'm here to tell you that this ends now." "Your Honor," Gideon started. "Shut up and listen." Harriman pulled out a piece of paper. "This is a writ from the territorial governor. It orders Samuel Miller to cease all harassment of your family, effective immediately. If he or his boys come after you again, they'll be the ones facing charges. Not you." Clara stared at him. "How?" "Because I wrote to the governor and explained the situation," Harriman said. "Explained how the Millers have been using their money and influence to terrorize a family that's done nothing wrong except refuse to bow down. And the governor, who's been looking for a reason to put Miller in his place for years, was happy to oblige." "Why would you do that?" Gideon asked. Harriman looked at him for a long moment. "Because 3 years ago, I asked your boy if he tried to be kind. And he said yes. He said he warned them twice before fighting back. That stuck with me. Made me wonder how many other people in this territory try to be kind before life beats it out of them." He glanced toward the cabin, where Caleb was watching from the window. "I heard he didn't warn them this time. That worries me, because if we lose people like him, people who at least try to do the right thing, we're all in trouble." He handed the writ to Gideon. "Give this to the sheriff next time he shows up asking questions. And tell your boy that he gets one more chance, one more fight, one more act of revenge, and I can't protect him anymore. Understood?" "Understood," Gideon said quietly. Harriman mounted his horse. Before he rode away, he looked at Clara. "You asked your husband if he'd be kind. That's the question that built this family. Don't forget it now." Then he was gone, leaving them standing in the clearing with a piece of paper that changed everything. That night, Clara sat down with Caleb at the table while Gideon and Rose slept. "The judge came by today," she said. "I saw. He brought something that should keep the Millers away from us, for good." Caleb's face flickered with something. Relief, maybe, or disappointment that the fight was over. "But he also said something else," Claire continued. "He said you get one more chance, one more fight, and he can't help you anymore." "I didn't start it." "I know. But you didn't try to stop it either, and that's the problem." Clara leaned forward. "Caleb, I need you to understand something. The world is full of people like the Millers, people who think power means they can hurt whoever they want. And you can spend your whole life fighting them, hitting back, taking revenge. But if you do that, you become just like them. You become the thing you hate. So what am I supposed to do? Just let them win? No. You're supposed to be better than them. You're supposed to choose kindness even when it's hard. Even when it hurts, even when every part of you wants to hit back." Clara's voice softened. "That's what makes you different from Thomas Miller. Not that you can fight, that you choose not to when you don't have to." Caleb was quiet for a long time. "What if I don't want to be kind anymore? What if I'm tired of it?" "Then you fake it until you remember why it matters," Clara said. "You fake it until you meet someone who needs kindness more than you need revenge. And then you choose them instead of your anger." "Did you do that?" "Every day," Clara admitted. "Every single day for 6 years after my daughter died. I woke up angry at the world, and I chose to be kind anyway. Not because it made me feel better, but because it was the only way I knew how to stay human." Caleb looked at her with eyes that had seen too much for 12 years. "Does it get easier?" "No," Clara said honestly, "but it gets more important." The years continued their slow march forward. The Millers rebuilt their mill, but it was smaller, less profitable. Samuel's influence in town waned as other families rose to fill the gap. Thomas left for the city eventually, looking for opportunities his father could no longer provide. The rumors about the Holt family faded into old news, then into history, then into something that people barely remembered. Caleb grew into a young man who was quiet and careful, who thought before he acted, who helped neighbors without being asked. He never forgot the lesson from that night at the table, even when it cost him. Especially when it cost him. Rose grew into a force of nature, fearless and loud and full of questions that nobody could answer. She became the first person in the family to attend the new school that opened in Aspen Ridge, walking 3 miles each way because she refused to let distance stop her from learning. And Clara and Gideon, It happened on a cold night in November, 14 years after that first desperate bargain in the saloon. They were sitting by the fire, the children long asleep, when Gideon spoke. "I love you." Clara looked up from her sewing, surprised. They'd never said those words. Never needed to. Their partnership had been built on respect and necessity and shared purpose, not romance. "I know," she said finally. "Do you love me?" Clara thought about it. About 14 years of mornings and evenings, of shared work and shared silence, of building something from nothing in the middle of nowhere. About the way he'd looked at her that first night when she'd agreed to marry him, like she was a miracle he didn't deserve. About the way he still looked at her sometimes. "Yes," she said, "I do." "Should we?" Gideon gestured vaguely at the sleeping arrangements. "I mean, we're married, for real now, not just on paper. Should we move you out of the corner by the stove?" Clara smiled. "I think that's long overdue." He smiled back, and it was the same smile he'd given her 14 years ago when she'd saved his family. That night, for the first time since their wedding, they shared a bed. Not out of necessity or convenience, but because they wanted to. Because somewhere in the brutal work of survival, they'd found something that looked an awful lot like love. Caleb was 16 when a girl from town started coming around the cabin, making excuses to borrow tools or ask questions about trap lines. Her name was Anna, and she had her mother's kindness and her father's stubborn determination. Gideon and Clara watched them dance around each other for months before finally sitting down together. Rose was 13 when she announced she wanted to become a teacher. Not in Aspen Ridge, somewhere bigger, somewhere she could make a difference. Clara's heart broke a little at the thought of losing her, but she helped Rose apply to the territorial teaching program anyway. And when Caleb was 19 and brought Anna to the cabin to ask for their blessing to marry her, Clara and Gideon said yes without hesitation. The wedding took place in the spring, in a meadow near the cabin with wildflowers everywhere. Half of Aspen Ridge showed up, not because they were friends with the Holt family, but because over the years the Mountain family had become something else. A symbol. Proof that you could survive the hard years and come out the other side still standing. Pike gave a toast that made everyone laugh. Judge Harriman, ancient now but still sharp, officiated. And when it came time for Caleb to say his vows, he looked at Anna and said the same words his father had said to his mother 14 years earlier. "I will be kind to you, I promise." Anna smiled. "I know you will." Clara watched them and felt something settle in her chest. This was what they'd built. Not just a family, but a legacy. The kind of legacy that said kindness mattered more than power, that choosing to be gentle in a brutal world was the bravest thing a person could do. Years later, when Gideon's beard was white and Clara's hands were too stiff for sewing, they sat on the porch of the cabin and watched their grandchildren play in the clearing. Caleb and Anna had built their own cabin nearby. Rose had gone east to teach, but came home every summer with stories that made their heads spin. "You ever regret it?" Gideon asked. "Saying yes that night?" "Yes." Clara thought about the question, about the scared widow she'd been, sitting in the back of a saloon with nothing to lose. About the desperate mountain man who'd asked an impossible question. About two frightened children who'd needed someone to choose them. "Not once," she said. "Me neither." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains they'd called home for more than 20 years. "You know what the best part is?" Clara said eventually. "What?" "We proved them wrong. Everyone who said it wouldn't work. Everyone who said you can't build a family from strangers and desperation and one good question. We proved them all wrong." "What was the question again?" Gideon asked, smiling because he knew exactly what it was. "Will you be kind?" Clara said. "And I was," Gideon said. "Every day. To you. To them. To everyone who gave me a chance. That's why it worked," Clara said. "Not because we were perfect. Not because it was easy. But because we chose kindness when we could have chosen anything else." In the clearing, one of their grandchildren fell and scraped their knee. Caleb was there immediately, scooping them up, checking the damage, speaking softly. The child stopped crying and hugged him. "He learned that from you," Gideon said. "He learned it from both of us," Clara corrected. They watched the sky turn purple, then gold, then dark. Inside the cabin, dinner was waiting. Tomorrow would bring new work, new challenges, new chances to choose who they wanted to be. But tonight, they sat together in the home they'd built and the family they'd chosen, And Clara understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Survival wasn't about being the strongest or the richest or the most powerful. It was about being kind when the world gave you every reason not to be. It was about building something worth keeping in the space between desperation and hope. It was about asking the right questions and having the courage to live by the answers. Years later, long after both Clara and Gideon were gone, people in Aspen Ridge still told the story of the mountain man who walked into a saloon asking for a wife. They told it to their children, who told it to theirs. And somewhere along the way, it stopped being about a desperate bargain and became something else entirely. It became a story about what happens when people choose kindness over cruelty, when they choose to build instead of destroy, when they choose to stay even when running would be easier. And at the heart of that story was a question that echoed through generations: will you be kind? The answer, it turned out, made all the difference.